Thank you again for coming, and I hope you're enjoying the CIJ Summer Conference. We have a very exciting session ahead of us. We will be learning more about how and learning more from the experience of a specific think tank in West Africa that has worked for the last few years on covering floods in Nigeria. And I think it's really important to note that sadly floods are now a current issue and increasingly becoming more and more frequent in many countries in the world. My experience coming from Sudan is that we have stopped asking, are we going to have floods this year? And we started to saying, how bad? Even when people pray, people actually pray for less worse floods this year. And I think that's a sad reality when you think about it, is that we are now accepting the fact that it's happening, and we're just hoping that it doesn't happen as bad as last year, for example. And the other thing to note is that climate change really hits the most poorest countries the hardest, and these are the countries that continue to live in vicious cycle. Every year, when a country is hit by floods, thousands, if not millions, are displaced and are affected, and by the time the next floods hit, those people wouldn't have recovered. So we're only contributing to more and more displaced people, more and more people in danger, and we're only hindering the infrastructure of the countries that find it the hardest to rebuild it. So there's a huge element of injustice, but there's also a lot of untold stories, and this is exactly what we want to talk today about. We will be hearing about how the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development have been covering the unprecedented floods in Nigeria. And to tell us more about this, I have with me here today Dr. Tobi Oluwatola, who's the Executive Director for the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development, which is a think tank founded in 2014 in Nigeria. And in 2020, CJID has expanded its operations to include Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and the Gambia. Tobi will share with us today insights into the work, the tools, techniques that they have used to effectively capture and report on the fast unfolding events in Nigeria. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tobi, and then we can have a conversation. Let's keep this as informal as we can. We want to learn from each other today. Thank you, Tobi.
Thank you, Lina. So I will start off with a short video documentary, a short documentary around the work that was done last year.
Devastating flood, cutting through schools, worship centers, farmlands, markets, and everything on its way. Since the start of this year's raining season, communities in several parts of Nigeria have experienced flooding that has left over 600 dead and over 1 million displaced. This is Abari community in Patani local government of Delta State. Every year, this community experiences flooding that threatens its existence, but left with no option, community members stayed after every incident.
This flood we are suffering so much in Abari here. There's no means for us to buy anything. Pregnant women, we could not even go to antenatal anymore.
This community of the soul, the flood don't take over community place. Our mothers and our fathers in the suffer. We're not going to help us. All the houses now just take place. How we go do? You see where we see. So far as they suffer, we even see fish shops, gathered up from inside water.
The flooding in 2022 came with no warning, cutting out every means of livelihood, every means. Agricultural produce is not left out.
We are here in Adamawa State, Dasin Hausa community at Fufu, a local government area, where flood has ravaged, ransacked many farmlands, where farmers are growing rice, maize, onion, pepper, and other vegetables. Most of the farmlands have been ransacked, submerged, and swept away by the flooding that happened within the last 2 months. The farmers are lamenting bitterly, and as you can see, a lot of them are already here trying to pick up the remnants of the crops that have been destroyed.
At the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development, with support from the Open Climate Reporting Initiative, of the Centre for Investigative Journalism, London, we have been exploring several intervention areas since years past. This year alone, we have engaged over 30 journalists in 5 countries to report on climate change in different programs, including the West Africa Climate Change Media Fellowship. According to Nigeria's Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, Disaster Management and Social Development, about 31 states have been affected by the flooding and over 300,000 hectares of land destroyed.
So yeah, that's the work. We can end here. All right. So thank you very much for joining us. So I'm not sure. Okay, mirror displays. Okay. All right. So just to get into some of the So last year, with support from OCRI, CJID. Went out and we started the program, West African Media Fellowship, by training a few journalists, about 38 journalists, and you've seen the chart on the right before. I think Deolu must have presented that yesterday. So we trained up about 38 journalists, and we started working towards COP 2027. Mostly trying to focus people's attention on things like, adaptation, mitigation, and to some degree loss and damage, right? And then October came, and then the floods happened. And fortunately, we had just trained a bunch of journalists, and we had some funding, so we released some funding. We had journalists give us some pitches, and we had about 10 journalists go to about 26 states in Nigeria. You saw from the documentary about 31 states were affected, and about 2 million people displaced, to over 300,000 hectares of farmland lost. So we decided to have journalists go to the field to get real human angle stories and help us understand what was really going on. So what I'm going to be showing you is the reports, a few of the reports that came from reporters going out to the field to investigate what was going on. And then in November, we brought together a few policymakers. And for us, the way we think about the work we do at the center is really at the intersection of creating an interface for the media, the people, but also with policymakers, because ultimately what we're trying to achieve is policy change. And policies is to effect policy, both at the local level and at the international level, that helps solve some of the problems that our journalists uncover. So last year we held the Climate Change Media Summit, where we presented what we found from the flood investigations, and we had all the key actors that hopefully can make a difference. And like Lina said earlier, these floods have now become a yearly occurrence, and it's not a question of whether or not the flood will happen, it's a question of how severe it will be. And 2022 Nigeria at least, had the worst flooding, and Ghana as well, had the worst flooding that we've ever had. All the meteorologists tell us that this year is going to be even worse. So clearly there is an effect of climate change going on. We recognize that, and our investigations also showed that yes, there is exacerbated flood risks due to climate change, but there's also the very real fact that the government every year in Nigeria at least dedicates about 2.3% of all its revenues to ecological protection and control, and that money doesn't achieve any projects. So you'll see from the investigations that we did that a lot of those communities have very terrible drainage, and some don't even have any means of drainage at all. And in many cases, there's also issues around how waste is disposed that goes and blocks drainages and things like that. And a lot of that, accountability, so there's accountability locally that is missing, but also accountability globally, because we saw, because of a lot of these reports that and the flooding that happened just in the run-up to COP27, there was the push to make sure that loss and damage was a big agenda item at COP27, and we're starting to see some traction. And the hope is that even going to COP28, hopefully there are not floods that are as bad, to push the agenda, to help push the conversation, but that these conversations start leading to very tangible results. Because in you would see from some of these reports, just thinking about the amount of farmland and farm produce that was lost, we are talking about billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in economic value that was destroyed, and not to talk about over thousands of about 2,400 houses that were destroyed, and 600 lives lost in one season, one flooding season. So clearly there is a very tangible economic cost that is real. So when we talk about the costs of climate change, it's not theoretical. It's real, and it's these people who typically wouldn't have a voice. So I'll just go through a few of the stories. So very, very quickly. So in Kogi State, for example, okay, I see that I'm running out of juice a little bit. So yeah, so in Kogi State, you see pictures from there. Many of the communities had to take shelter for months in IDP, for months after the flooding in IDPs and crowded classrooms. After the flooding really got them out of their communities, lots of houses were damaged, and they had to seek refuge in a few towns. You can see in Adamawa State, that's another state in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, again, mostly fishing and agrarian communities. People had to seek refuge in internally displaced people's camps. Adamawa State is one of the states that historically has been ravaged by Boko Haram. So they have a few internally displaced people camps that mostly secondary schools and whatnot, and that also has an impact on whether or not the kids can go to school and learn, because their schools have now been converted into refugee camps, essentially. So you had Bauchi State, and in Bauchi State particularly, there were hundreds of communities. Our investigators went to about 10 of those. Zaki, Gamawa, Ningi, Wargi, a bunch of communities, and in each of those communities, lots and lots of agricultural produce, but also just their farmlands lost to the flooding. And these are subsistence farmers. They're not very wealthy people who literally depend on their farm produce year in, year out to feed their families and to sell the excess and make some small money to send their kids to school and whatnot. So when they lose all their farm produce for the entire season, it's huge. It's many of them have to go hungry, and that has a ripple effect for those families. So many of them start to resort to planting in dry season, and you've got to recognize that these are also communities that are not farmlands, that are not properly irrigated. So in the dry season, they literally have to physically, go water their plants every day, and that just is not conducive for productivity, agricultural productivity as well. So it's a big thing when they lose all their produce. So in Yobe State, pretty much the same thing. Here we saw, our investigators saw about 400 houses destroyed and over 2,000 people in one zone alone, being displaced and had to leave their homes. Many of them camp in schools, as you can see in the pictures there. In Anambra State, that's in the southeast part of Nigeria, and this part of Nigeria is really a lot of industrial zones and a lot of big markets, big commercial areas. So you had the Onitsha main market and industrial, about 700 shops, all completely flooded. So these are people who trade, bring stuff from China, from wherever, and trade. And a lot of these people just lost everything. And again, these are people who don't typically have insurance. So when they lose, when 700 shops lose everything that is in them, that's billions of dollars in goods that you are not going to recover because there's no insurance, that these people are not covered. So about 21 local government areas, about 561,000 people affected, and about 41,000 displaced in this particular story. So each of these slides are individual stories that were reported by various reporters. Similar situation in Bayelsa. Bayelsa is one of the states that produce a lot of oil, and again, devastating floods. Food prices were up and whatnot. Just running through it, in Kano State is known for its textile markets, and the textile that gets the textile factories there. Again, lots of the textile manufacturing units were destroyed, and FEMA. Here, the assessment conducted revealed that about a little over 500 stores were affected, and properties lost about 2.5 billion naira. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 million in property lost. Again, these are poor people, so $4 million worth of property is quite a lot. So just going on in Imo State, that's another state, about 5,000 people displaced, and many had to go live with relatives in neighboring states. Again, several states. Here we're talking about over $500 billion naira. So here we get into some of the what could have been done differently, and we see our investigators or our data journalists uncovered that over $500 billion naira has been disbursed over the last 10 years in ecological funds that ideally, like I said before, could have really reduced the effect of these floods. So there's a lot of local accountability that is lacking in many of these communities. Again, just quantifying what the extent of the loss, about 23 trillion naira agricultural economy lost to last year's flooding alone. Again, just a few more stories from various communities. Just showing the extent of the floods. You can go just go on Premium Times. So we publish all the stories on Premium Times. So if you just go search Premium Times flooding 2022, you'd see many of these stories there. Here in Jigawa State, we saw about 47 schools completely damaged by the floods, and lots of rural health facilities impacted. The same is true in Delta State, and in here we saw also lots of electricity infrastructure. So it's not just the immediate flood, it's also that power then gets cut, and almost everywhere in all these communities when the flooding happens, electricity also goes. because in many cases the the grid is not very resilient to some of these hazards. So I think that was a big issue that we saw in Delta State. And also in beyond Nigeria, this is a report from Gambia, showing also lots of refugees and people who were affected by last year's floods. And in a lot of these cases, it's also because infrastructure to begin with is bad. So you've got roads that are not, properly, that don't have proper drainage, riverbanks that are not very solid, and things like that. That exacerbate the flooding in many cases. Again, just more stories around the floods. So in a nutshell, you had over 2 million people displaced, about 2,400 people sustained various injuries, about 600 people lost their lives. And at the time when we put this together, about 108,000 hectares of farmlands, but the claim is that it's a lot worse than that, and more than 200,000 houses damaged. So it goes back to the point that I started with, that there are really two big areas of accountability here. One being locally, all the funds over £500 billion naira, that's £500 billion naira will be somewhere in the last 10 years in Nigeria alone, would be somewhere in the neighborhood of I'm trying to do my numbers now. Close to $500 billion, about 500 billion, about £500 billion naira. I'm just trying to do the numbers. It's a lot of money. About $2 billion thereabouts. About $2 billion spent in ecological funds, but again, these communities are not protected. And more importantly, there's the global advocacy around loss and damage that we really need to bring back to the fore. And I'm hoping that that starts to lead to some concrete results going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tobi. And I really need to thank you and CJID for doing this work, because as we've seen on the last slides, you can see numbers. But what they did is that they went beyond the numbers. They've told the stories. Because when you see stories about flooding, when the international news do us the courtesy of reporting on floodings in other countries, they never go beyond the numbers. But 2 million is 2 million stories. It's a kid's school that got washed away, so they can't go to school anymore, and therefore the future is changed forever. It's a family house with all the memories, the culture, the heritage that got lost. It's a parent that can no longer provide for their families. It's really beyond the numbers, and that's what we really need to do. We need to tell the stories, the human side of things. And I think that's the work that we should be encouraging. We should be incentivizing journalists to be able to do this and have the needed resources and the needed skills to also navigate catastrophic events like this. So I'm going to start by using my chair privilege and ask the first few questions, and then I'll give you guys the chance. So Tobi, can you please, I'll give you 2 questions. Can you please explain to us how did CJID manage to navigate the challenges that comes with reporting on such fast-paced events? And building on that, can you tell us what are some of the lessons that you guys learned that could be applicable for other organizations and think tanks that want to report on floodings in their own countries?
Thank you very much. So first of all, just to set the background, so CJID is a think tank. We don't do any actual reporting ourselves, but we do have a sister organization called Premium Times that does a lot of the reporting work. Premium Times has a history since 2011 of being one of Nigeria's foremost investigative newsrooms. We're lucky to have all these people with lots of experience doing investigations, doing human angle stories, doing data journalism and open source intelligence and all that stuff. So we were lucky to leverage Premium Times capabilities, but at the same time, you've got you're telling the stories of real human beings who are going through a tragedy. And you've got to bring humanity into it, because many times people are sometimes, especially people are also embarrassed by the things that they're going through, and they wonder if something they did, and remember, these are also communities that are very religious. So sometimes some of them even think that, oh, maybe it's something they did that is making this the case. So you've got to be, to wear that hat and be very sensitive when you tell these people's stories. You've got to make sure that you get the right consent. Obviously, you try to avoid capturing children and people who are not old enough to give consent. But even with the older people, you've got to do that. But one thing that we found to be quite encouraging is that a lot of the people truly believe that, or at least still believe that government can do something about it, and that the work that journalists do matter. And that it matters in making sure that their stories are told and that the right policymakers are able to see those stories. So we often find that in many of the communities we go to, they're very eager to tell their stories, because otherwise no one else will. Otherwise, there's almost no other way to get their stories to the right policymakers to take action. And we found in many of the communities that we've gone to, at least a few of the communities we've gone to, some local lawmaker gets embarrassed that his community is being spotlighted, and then we see some drainage being built. But those occurrences are few and far between. So we need more. We need more of these stories to be told, so that there will be more action on the ground.
Thank you, Tobi, and these are really, really valuable lessons, and I agree with you. Whenever you talk to someone who has literally just lost everything, I think that's not an easy situation to be in, and you need to balance between doing your work of reporting, but also being a human and talking to them in a human way and sympathizing with them. So that's not an easy thing, and kudos to all those journalists who've done this amazing work and got the story out there.
That's a beautiful suggestion. Certainly, there are opportunities for solutions-based storytelling, but then one also has to be cognizant of the platforms on which these communities can receive their stories. So Premium Times certainly does most of its work on digital platforms. So one of the things that CJID has been doing is working with local journalists in various communities, in various parts of, in various local communities to get them to write those solution stories in the mediums that in the media that the local communities use, mostly radio. You would find that most of the communities across West Africa listen more to radio than anything else. You would scarcely see a community where people read newspapers or read online news, but radio, you could reach folks that way. But I also take that as a very interesting challenge to say that as we go forward with the work that we're doing with training journalists, we incorporate a lot more very practical elements of solutions journalism solutions that communities could implement. I'd be curious to hear some ideas from the room. What solutions are possible? Because I mean, you're talking about huge communities, big people's farmlands. So yes, maybe local communities could. I'm just curious to see how much agency do these communities really have against these huge natural hazards. I'd be keen to hear ideas. of solutions pieces. So I get it, you know, things like wastes, and so those are low-hanging fruits. But when you know, huge floods come and ravage all your farmland, what can you do? Maybe build drainages yourself. It's just hard to see how people can help themselves short of, you know, billions of dollars in investments. People don't read the stories unless it affects them. that's what tends to happen. So yeah. So how do you tell these human angle stories in a way that continues to be engaging? I think in the nutshell, it comes down to telling the stories of real human beings, as opposed to when 1 million people. When we say 1 million people die, it's a number. It's 1 million people that died. But when my brother dies, then I feel that one. So it's really about humanizing even the people in your stories. So if you go into some of these stories that I brushed through, they really get into the lives and the livelihoods of the people that of the protagonists in those stories, in each of those stories. And we find that, you know, just being able to tell the stories of these people, someone who's put all his life savings and spent so much, sacrificed so much to build a business that is still fledgling in Onitsha market, and then the floods happen, and all his life savings is gone, and his kids are in school. Maybe one kid is still a little sick. You know, just being able to see those stories from the perspectives of the people who are affected by it, I think many times can pull the heartstrings of policymakers and the decision makers a little bit more than just the generic story of, oh, we've done satellite imagery and we've seen that there's 200,000 or 300,000 hectares of farmland that is lost, but who are the human beings behind those farmlands, and what does it mean, the humans behind those farmlands? In many cases, you know, you had, it was just a case of, okay, people lost their jobs because they work on farmlands that don't belong to them. In other cases, you know, it's people who have saved years and years of income to purchase a small family plot of land that they're farming, and now, you know, they you know, a lot of their crops, but also the topsoil has been washed out, so it would take a while before the soils recover. So it's really just being able to tell. For us, we found that it's being able to tell those very concrete stories tend to have been helpful.
And I think if I can also actually share an example from Sudan. When we write about floods, yes, most of the times you are targeting the policymakers to show where the gap was and what could have been done differently to mitigate some of the impacts. But also sometimes they do actually contribute to raising awareness. Because, for example, in Sudan, the civil defense one time complained that they told people, we know the floods are going to hit your country, your neighborhood, and you need to evacuate to save the life of your family. Some people refused because of religious reason. They said, hey, if it's going to happen to me, it's going to happen. That's God's plan. But when you report and you show people that someone like them, someone they can relate to, and you even explore that religious aspect and show them that this is not God's plan, this is you protecting your family, yourself, and your future, people respond when they see someone like them going through the same thing. So I think while it's targeting policymakers, it does help people understand how they can respond to these things. What can they do? Because sadly, people have to do something. Like the governments will never be, interventions will never be enough. It's barely anything. So it shows people how can they save lives. So it really is important to report. And I think like Tobi said, you only engage when it really matters to you. And sadly, it does matter to millions of people right now.
So, yeah, so obviously there are other extreme events like droughts, wildfires, and whatnot that obviously need reported. But I think with each of these stories too, so one of the stories that I didn't talk much about is how the flooding also exacerbates some of the existing tensions between farmers and herders in some certain states in the country. So just to give some context to that, because of the desertification and droughts in the northern parts of Nigeria, lots of pastoral farmers start to migrate a little further south and go take their cattle to go graze in people's farmlands, and then that leads to conflicts and conflicts and lives are lost. And what we found with these floods is that also, the floods in this case, then continue to exacerbate some of those tensions. So I think that, again, with telling stories around wildfires, telling stories around droughts, I think it's important that we continue to stress the fact that these are real effects of climate change. These are real effects of what humans have done to the world, and that there are real costs to real human beings that necessitate a call for loss and damage financing to fund some of those livelihoods coming back. In many cases, there are many people who've lost their homes to wildfires. There are people who've lost their livelihoods to droughts and things like that. But I agree with you that sometimes floods are a little easier to tell, because you can more readily identify the victim, the human victim, than a few other things. I don't know if I answered your question. I just rambled a bit. It's okay.
And thank you so much, Tobi. First of all, I really want to thank you. I think this was a really good overview, and I think hearing the interventions from the audience really shows how diverse and how many perspectives you can look at this problem. Just to finish off, since CJID has had an extensive coverage of floods last year, and sadly you've mentioned that the outlook shows that the floods this year will be even more, do you guys have plans in place already of how you're planning to cover? This can be taken from a project perspective in terms of financing, but also from preparing and making sure there's more capacity within your journalists?
Thank you very much. I think one thing we're focused on this as we approach this year, so is that we're working on a policy brief right now about how we communicate early warning signals and how early warning gets communicated. So you talked earlier about people evacuating early. We lost 600 lives last year. Even if we can't prevent the economic loss, at least we can prevent lives being lost this year. So one of the things, interventions we're working on this year is to make sure that this policy brief around early warning and how to make that communication effective get to not just policymakers in the various states that we expect to be affected, but also the media in the various states that will be affected, so that that early warning gets, it's very, very prominent, and that people know when to evacuate, what to do, what to expect, and things like that, because that was really lacking last year. So that's one thing, and obviously we know that for various reasons, people, these things, not everyone will do something about, not everyone will respond. So we know that we'll have to tell these stories again, unfortunately, if and when the floods do happen, if and when the disasters do happen. And sometimes, as journalists, you really can only do so much, Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Tobi, and I do encourage everyone to go check out Premium Times.
Premium Times.
Premium Times, you can find all the stories that Tobi have given an overview about. Like we said, these are not numbers, these are stories, and it's really a good reminder of how bad climate change is and how bad it will get. So please join me in thanking Tobi for this insightful session.